And it looks like we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Atlas Project. I'm Ben Baer. With me is Greg Salmieri. And tonight we're going to be discussing Part 2, Chapter 3 of Atlas Shrugged, which is called The Sanction of the Victim, though I think I might have put the wrong title on the Atlas Shrugged page. I'll have to fix that in a minute. But before I do, let me just make a few quick announcements. So tonight is a big chapter in a number of ways. One is not so much in terms of the length of the chapter itself, but in terms of the heaviness of the content. There are two major speeches in this chapter, both of which, interestingly, were reprinted in Ayn Rand's book For the New Intellectual. And so this book is heavier in terms of the intellectual content. And as a result of that, we're going to probably be running a little longer tonight than we usually do. We usually try to go for about 1.5 hours. We might run as late as 2. Some people have been asking for us to go 2 hours. This is not a commitment on our part to do so regularly. But at least for tonight, given everything we have to discuss, it's a good chance that that might happen. And then another consequence of this is we're going to be planning on having another supplemental episode probably next week. Later next week, we haven't exactly planned on when to do that. We'll announce it when we know more. But the main topic of that supplemental broadcast will be the speech that Francisco does at the end of this chapter on the meaning of sex. So that should be an interesting conversation, and we will be announcing more about it later on. So Greg, I think that's everything I had by way of business, and I'm just ready to fix this title. But you want to take things over in terms of introducing the background for the chapter?
So this chapter, it's named The Sanction of the Victim. It's chapter 4, right? And it's about Rearden putting into practice some of the ideas he's been developing over the prior several chapters. This phrase, the sanction of the victim, has come up a few times, right? In the first chapter, he said that the looters needed some kind of sanction from them. In particular, Stadler needed a sanction from Dagny that she could only give him because she's the victim. Francisco, in chapter 3, talked to Rearden about the importance of morality, that there are different codes of morality, and that there's such a thing as a moral sanction, which is really important. Indeed, what's drawn Rearden to Francisco is the fact that Francisco gives Rearden a moral sanction, which he should have demanded from everybody, but doesn't. And as Francisco is making some of these points about the importance of a moral code, and that Rearden has a particular moral code and is owed a sanction for it, and that other people have another moral code, and we'll talk more about these ideas soon, the words, the sanction of the victim, ring in Rearden's head as a kind of indication that this is a progress down the path he's been thinking his way through, right? So this is material from previous chapters that's bearing on what he's putting into practice here. Also, from previous chapters, part of the idea of the sanction is that what the looters need from Rearden and Dagny is for them to juggle reality for the looters by pretending to see reality in the way they, the looters, pretend to see it. This is something Rearden realized before he even realized it was specifically a moral sanction. Another idea that we have from Rearden in the just formed in the last chapter, in chapter 3, is that there's some practical flaw in Lillian's scheme of punishment for him. He doesn't quite put his finger on what it is, but that there is one. And he has the same idea that there's a flaw in Floyd Ferris's attempt to blackmail him in the unusual way Ferris is. And he says, when you put me on trial, you'll discover what it is. So now we're going to see his trial in this scene. When he had those ideas, he didn't yet have the idea, which Francisco gives him, that there are competing moral codes. That one moral code, the one by which Rearden has always lived, but which he didn't name and state explicitly, is the source of life and efficacy. And that there's another moral code, which Francisco doesn't say as much about, but says is the one that is the weapon that his family and others have had over him. And if your code is the code of life, Mr. Rearden, what then is theirs? That question's left unanswered. But we can see Rearden thinking in this chapter about, well, what is Lillian's code? What is this other code? And I think we also have in some of what Francisco is saying or suggesting to Rearden in the last chapter, the idea that the sanction of the victim is, in some cases at least, a moral sanction that involves producers putting their virtues in the service of looters by accepting or making allowances for the looter's moral code, which is opposite to that of the producers. Okay, so that's some context for what Rearden's been thinking going into this chapter. Two more points by way of agenda setting about what we're doing in this session and the upcoming sessions. I want us to be paying more attention to long-range integrations across what's going on across chapters, what's Rearden learned now that's impacting his action, and then what does he learn from those actions. So I want us to be thinking about kind of tracing the plot longer range. That's why I started with a summary of what he's learned up till now. And another thing I think we should be doing more than we have been in the past is trying to draw connections between the philosophical principles that are progressively getting articulated in the novel and our lives in our world. Because more and more in part 2, and we'll see it in part 3, we're getting a philosophy articulated, we're getting principles articulated, and these principles are being induced from the events in the world of the novel. But we don't live exactly in the world of the novel. We live in this world, and the novel is based on or recreates this world, but in accordance with the author's judgments of what's significant or interesting about this world and her views of what's true of it. And so to think about whether these principles are right, we want to think about, is our world like the world of the novel in the ways that are relevant to these principles being induced from the novel. So we had a couple of our questions that we asked on the Facebook group this week bore on this issue of relation to the real world and relation to our own experience. And we're, I think, going to have some more of that as we go forward. Okay, so that's just preliminary material. We want to start off by talking about Rearden and his family. Ben, I should say, I hear when you're clicking and typing, which means that the internet does also.
Yeah, I recently muted because of that. I should be muted now.
Well, but I hear you, so you can't be muted. Now you're muted. And you're miming for us. Good. All right, well then I'll go on my own for a bit until Ben deals with those issues, and he'll come back in when he's ready to. Okay, so we begin in our first scene with Thanksgiving. All the various things at the Rearden's Thanksgiving is pointed out. The various items on the table and how much they cost, and Carrie Ann was displeased by some of the decorating choices, the pumpkin drooling raisins and so forth. But anyway, we're told about the artist's touch that Lillian has and so forth, and that nobody mentions the price of these things because that wouldn't be spiritual. And we have the Rearden's Thanksgiving, which is Hank, Lillian, Rearden's mother, who never gets named, and Philip. And what's going on at this dinner? Thoughts? What's, at least, early on in the dinner, eventually they get to talking about his trial. But even prior to that, what's the tenor of this dinner, this Thanksgiving, this holiday?
Everyone but him.
Yeah, they thank everyone but Rearden, right? The cook and God and Lillian, who thought to have this peasant's shoe, which was such a nice touch, that takes real taste, And but no one thanks Rearden. He's the only one who's not thanked. And Merrill says the same thing, thanking everybody but Hank. And in particular, in cases where it's really glaring. So Rearden's mother is on about, what's her name? Is it Lindsay? Lucy Judson, who's become Hank, she had a son just about your age, and now she's a toothless hag begging in the street, just wrapped in a man's coat, there but for the grace of God go I, right? But I mean, the subject, no, her son was, apparently doesn't put her up with gilded shoes and nice Thanksgiving dinners, right? So it's there but for the grace of Rearden, so the story implies go I. Ben?
And here's maybe a good place for me to jump in, the grace of God issue, because, and we talked about this briefly in one of the spoilers episodes that we did recently. But it's interesting that the scene opens and closes with two different kinds of Thanksgiving banquets, as it were. There's the one that Rearden's having with his family, who doesn't want to give thanks to him, only wants to give thanks to everybody else in the world, except for him. But then at the end, there's a couple things. One is that Rearden offers that he's going to sell Rearden metal to Dagny against the law, and she says, "All right, Hank, I won't thank you," but makes it a lie in the way that she looks at her. So she's at least saying thank you to him. But then they both together celebrate a kind of Thanksgiving toast with the portrait of Nat Taggart looking over them, and them looking over the city. And it's probably noteworthy that previously in the book, Nat Taggart has been described as Dagny's only concept of the exalted. The way that she looks at him at the statue in the Taggart Terminal, which is described kind of like a cathedral. And so they are saying thank you to Nat Taggart, and Dagny said thanks to Hank. And if you remember also, there was this connects somewhat to the scene from the chapter, the non-commercial, at the party that Rearden was throwing, because there was this whole discussion we had about what this feeling was that he was having of burying his head, and how it related to the contrast he saw between the dark, cold night outside and the comfortable setting inside. And there's something similar happening here, I think. And that feeling is probably somewhat related, has a similar object, if you will. And Skylar says,
I'm amused by Skylar's the comment.
Hank's giving. That's a good one.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered about the Thanksgiving dinner, something that's probably been a feature of all of Rearden's Thanksgiving dinners, at least since his marriage and probably his whole life since he's been with these people. They're not appreciative of him and his role in it, nor of any of the other producers. So it's not just that they don't like Hank, but they're not interested in, the farmer who grew the turkey and so forth. I mean, Lillian does acknowledge the cook, who, might have done a really good job, in fact, but not any of the industrial type of producers. But there is something specific about this Thanksgiving dinner that is wouldn't have been true of all of Rearden's Thanksgiving. It's the day before his trial. And what is his family's take on that?
Mother says cases like this aren't supposed to go to trial, they're supposed to be settled behind the scenes, which we know is quite true
That was Lillian.
in this case.
Yeah, that was Lillian, I think, who said that, but nevertheless, it is.
And the mother says, what happens if you go to jail? How will we cope?
Have you thought of us?
Yeah, so the mother's concerned about his going to jail, but because it will be bad for her, and not, she'll be embarrassed, basically, right, if he goes to jail. Lillian says these things aren't supposed to come to trial. Carrie Ann?
But even more than that, I think the most important thing she tries to attack Hank with is that now that he's not morally superior anymore, he can't cast the first stone, and hence is not allowed to stand on trial with a clear conscience.
Yeah, so Lillian is trying to manipulate Hank by strings of guilt, right? And she's in particular trying to stop him from taking a stand at his trial. Are you going to take some great stand at your trial, Hank? Isn't that hypocrisy? In your case, certainly. And she's sort of hammering away at it. That's how this starts, this topic starts for them. And Lillian, Hank is... Put aside the effect on Hank of this for a moment. What does Hank observe about Lillian's manner of dealing with him? She's fine with it, you say?
She's not dejected. She's not upset that he's having an affair. She seems to be inspired by it.
Yeah, in particular, she seems to be enjoying it. She hasn't gained weight, but everything about her has grown plump, even her voice. right? And he had at first been thinking this is a form of pain or torture for her. But more and more he's coming to think, no, that's not true. She's liking this. This is what she wants, which is really interesting. So that's Lillian's attitude towards it. She's kind of got a gloating thing going on. His mother's just concerned about, she doesn't care who's right or wrong in the trial. All business is just dirty politics, and all politics is dirty business. I don't want to understand it. Francesca says we're getting interested advice and chronic reproaches. The mother, I guess it's Brian saying about the mother, is obsessed with decorum and protocol. Brian says they always call him Henry. That's true. Everybody calls him Hank, Dagny says in the first chapter when Jim's annoyed about her for doing it. But his family, it turns out, calls him Henry. So that's interesting. They don't call him by the name he seems to prefer. What about Philip? What's Philip's attitude towards his trial?
He talks as though Hank wasn't even there.
He talks as though Hank's not there. I'm moving my cameras around to try to figure out how to best get everybody in. Now, let me see if I can turn this one and get Will a little bit better in the shot. We're a little more spread out today than usual. Yeah, so Philip talks as though Hank wasn't there. He talks to to their mother about the case. She says, I don't understand the thing. And he says, well, I could explain it to you quite simply and so forth, as though Hank's not even there. And he's accusing him, but he's not even saying you, Hank, are a criminal or whatever. He's talking, Henry did this, to the mother. So, yeah, he's talking as though he's not there, accusing him. Even before that, when he does talk to Hank, what does he talk to Hank about and what's his attitude?
Because they're saying about you, he's smiling because the papers are trashing him.
Yeah, have you read what the papers
he's
have
gloating
said?
On this whole view of Hank, and I love the way Ayn Rand says that he seems like he's on solid ground, and then all of a sudden Hank's response, he's on thin ice.
So it begins with, he's talking about Henry of Hank. Have you read what the papers are saying about you? No. Oh, you should. Why? Well, they've got all these insults and so forth. And Henry says that's interesting. But what he says it's interesting about is that Philip is enjoying that. So Philip's pleased that this is happening to his brother. Ken says Ken points out that what he later says, what Philip later says is that Hank's guilty as hell when the subject of the trial comes up more in earnest. Okay, so what is Hank thinking during all of this? He has some new realizations that are significant. He had already had the idea that there was a flaw in Lillian's scheme. During dinner, he identifies or articulates that to himself more. Right? Any thoughts? Anyone want to comment on this aspect of the scene? And there's so much to cover in this chapter that there's a lot we're going to have to go through quickly. But if anyone has, well, I'll just read. The practical flaw is that her only power, that is power to enact her punishment, was the power of his own virtues. What if he chose to withdraw it? So that's a quote from 465, and it's at the end of a larger paragraph where he makes this point in more detail. She wants him to feel guilt and shame, but that requires his acceptance of what he did is wrong and his caring about what's right and wrong. So her punishment requires the power of his own virtue, his own rectitude, and he could choose to withdraw it. So that's the first issue of the practical flaw. And the second issue ties it to one of Francisco's points about there being multiple codes of value. Quoting again from 465, an issue of guilty thought had to rest on his acceptance of the code of justice that pronounced him guilty. But his code and the virtues that they're relying on to punish him, his caring about being a good person, his integrity and so forth, come from a different code. So we have the idea here that there are two codes. It's not just you care about morality or not, or you're good or you're not, or am I moral or not, but there are different things you might mean by moral, different codes of morality. And Hank has one, and there might be others. And Lillian seems to have another. And reading later from Go ahead, Ben. Yeah.
Interestingly, Greg, you're doing a good job picking up on when I'm going to talk. Of course, the conversation that Rearden was having with Francisco was not on the topic of morality as it pertained to like family relations. Remember, it came up more directly in relation to the morality of his business, and he was trying to demonstrate to Francisco, why he should run his life the way that he runs his business. So Rearden's seeing the generalizability of what Francisco was saying there, if he's applying that to this. And indeed, Pooja, in the online discussion prior to class, pointed out the passage on page 466, where Hank starts to think that the secret that he's discovered is a much greater much greater than the problem of his marriage, that he had grasped the formula of a policy practice more widely throughout the world than he dared to contemplate at the moment. And probably later in this chapter, we're going to see some other cases where the same formula applies.
And the particular issue of it to codes, I think, is significant. There's this issue of he's combining a lot of ideas here, ideas learned in his conversations extensively about his career. I mean, Francisco says that what they're talking about is why he doesn't apply the same moral code to his dealings with people that he does to his work. So as Francisco sees it, it would apply more widely than just literally his dealings with suppliers and things like that, but presumably to all his social dealings. And Francisco recognizes in their first meeting that Rearden is very unhappy. And he's at a party being thrown for his own anniversary, and he's miserable at it. So Francisco must have some sense that Hank's is not only his business life that's a problem. He knows Hank's lonely, for example. But anyway, but I don't think Francisco holds it as, or Rearden holds it as a conversation about his personal life, and he's now drawing those connections. So there's this idea that there are multiple codes, Rearden's code and this enemy code, that's these other people's weapon against him. And he's thinking about this point when he's thinking about the flaw in Lillian's scheme of punishment. For the punishment to be effective, it relies on his virtues, which come from a certain code, but on that code, which has now been articulated to him by Francisco, he doesn't have a negative judgment of himself. He has a positive judgment of himself. So it requires him taking over and incorporating into that code ideas from the alien code. So let me just read a passage on this. This is from 465. What was the code on which she acted? What sort of code permitted the concept of a punishment that required the victim's own virtue as the fuel to make it work? And a few other quotes about this code. It's a code that would equate virtue with pain. It would count upon his virtue and use it as an instrument of torture to practice blackmail with the victim's own generosity as the sole means of extortion. I see Dan Burke, or Dan, online, we're trying not to say last names, has noted that line. One way to think about this code issue is it's like a virus, right? Like a virus comes in and takes over the machinery of a cell and uses the machinery of that cell against the cell, but to execute the virus's instructions, which are antithetical to the code that's internal to the cell. Well, likewise, what Lillian is doing is her moral code is the way it works is by getting its hooks into Rearden and using the machinery of his life, his moral code, his virtues, to enact alien instructions and make him act in a way that's against, use the power generated by his code to act against his code. So it's like a virus, or the word Rand uses is parasite. Yeah, Ben.
As to the nature of the code or virus, let me toss something out there, at least for consideration. I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about this. But I think we get at least a little bit of a clue as to the nature of the code from some of what leads up to Rearden's thinking about this. I find it interesting that Lillian in particular, who's the master at this use of this code, is emphasizing that Rearden's nothing but human, that he's made from the same shoddy human fabric that gives way just as quickly, and the day of the hero is past, the human is the imperfect. And of course, she mentions the explicit reference to the New Testament about who are you to cast the first stone. Now, I'm not suggesting that Lillian's using an overtly religious moral code. There's no special reason to think she's especially religious. But the beginning of the chapter does have all this invocation of the thanks to God and grace of God. And I mean, this whole emphasis on the imperfection of humanity is certainly something that's strongly associated with the religious conception of original sin. And there's the reference directly to the Bible. So does this give us any clue as to the nature of the code in question? That's the question.
That it's a possibly religious code. Yeah, Robert.
So it was only a few chapters earlier when Rearden, it's actually the Wyatt's Torch chapter, he says he would not fight, he would fight but only as one guilty wretch against the others. He did not pronounce the words, but the pain was their equivalent. Who am I to cast the first stone? So he was saying this to himself a couple of chapters earlier. That's how much he's progressed.
That now only Lillian is saying it, and he's regarding it as alien and bad. Good. So what conclusion does he draw about Lillian in particular at this point? I mean, he sees this as a monstrous evil. He sees it as a bigger issue than his marriage. This is something that's going on in the world. There's this horrible moral code that's being used this way. Yeah, Carrie? Yeah.
But that he says he doesn't hate her enough to believe that she could really do something in such a cold-blooded recognition of wanting to inflict this sort of pain. And so he's made a lot of progress, but there's a lot of textual evidence that he's not yet ready to extrapolate it all the way. He said he didn't find it possible to believe that he didn't dare contemplate it any further at the moment. He would not believe it of her. It's not that he did not. He refused to believe it of her.
But he does at least in this entertain explicitly the question, is Lillian doing this fully deliberately? What would that mean? That would mean she's pure evil, he thinks. And then he thinks, is that the right conclusion to draw of her? And he seems to take some time over that, right? And he decides, no, I saw her smile once, and she seemed nice years ago, and so forth, and I can't say she's pure evil. But at least he's now thinking maybe she's pure evil. That's occurring to him.
Might be, but he's still in a number of places as he won't make that judgment on it.
But he realizes the premise of the code she's working on is evil. So you would think if you knew somebody was doing that maybe inadvertently or wasn't quite fully aware, you might try and correct their course, say, listen, this is what you're doing to me.
Mm-hmm.
Huh, yeah.
But he doesn't do that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Greg?
So, yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I mean, Rearden's being, he's going above and beyond the call of duty here to give her the benefit of the doubt. And it's true that, there's a difference between doing something to somebody accidentally and doing something to them on purpose. And that's part of what we use to decide whether they're culpable for evil. But at the same time, you got to wonder, is evil ever fully conscious of its own nature, as he seems to be imagining it here? She doesn't know exactly the nature of what she's doing, therefore she couldn't be evil. Well, is anyone ever as mustache twirly as that when they're being evil? Ha 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 ha, I'm going to destroy him and I like to do it because it's bad. Is that a psychologically realistic portrayal of what evil even is? And if it's not, is he using the right standard here for deciding whether or not she is actually evil?
One thing to think about then is, what is this book's vision of evil? And I think we're starting to see Rearden reflect on that. And whether it involves full consciousness or what kind of consciousness it involves, I think is a topic that's going to become clearer and clearer as we go on, including specifically if Lillian is what's motivating Lillian. Iris, you had something you wanted to say on this topic.
Things he says is to convict a human being of that practice was a verdict of irrevocable damnation, and he knew that he would not believe it of anyone so long as there was a possibility of a doubt remained. And so, he's broadened it, and because he doesn't want to do it with anyone, he doesn't want to say anyone is pure evil.
Yeah, this is a serious charge he's considering against her, and that's part of why he's not saying it flippantly. But so from the points that Amish made, one thing to stress is even if he's not ready to convict her of doing this out of pure evil, he is now on the view that the code on which she's acting is evil. She's acting in an evil way, she's enacting an evil policy, and then the question is she doing it deliberately or out of some kind of ghastly mistake? Maybe this is going on a lot in the world and she's kind of picked it up but doesn't know fully what she's doing. But there's something he's ready to condemn as evil now, even if it's not her, and now we have some of the reasons why he's not ready to condemn her. Okay, so Rearden makes a significant stand at dinner, and the stand comes after Philip says, well, I think it's not a complicated case, and he's just a criminal, and so forth. Is the wrong chapter on the screen? People are saying. Oh, my mother's saying the wrong chapter's on the screen. It
was at first, and I thought I fixed
now?
it. I think it's fixed, but they might have an old version cached or something.
All right. I also might not have updated the caption in the software I'm broadcasting from. Anyway, we'll fix, if any of the captions are wrong, we'll fix them after the fact. Okay. So Mike Reel asks a good question, but let's hold off on that question for a moment. Okay, so Mike asked a good question about casting the first stone and what about being judgmental and should you be judgmental? Let's come back to that either later today or there are some future scenes where I think that question really comes sharply into focus for.
And Mike, remind us about it if we don't remember to get back to it.
Okay, so Rearden's stand is Philip goes on talking as though Rearden's not there, as Will points out, about how he's a criminal and the courts are full of cases of this kind. And Rearden says, keep talking like that and I'll throw you out. Finally, Robert says. So what is the effect of this? And what's driving Rearden here? Ben, you had some thoughts on this.
I'm not sure which thought of mine you're referring to, but it's probably. Did people notice there's where Francisco's influence pops up the most directly in his thinking about what Philip is saying? That's a question for either New York or for the live audience. We asked last week about what evidence there was in which, for where Rearden's under the influence of Francisco's thinking. And here you get really explicit evidence of it because he actually echoes one of Francisco's lines, one of his questions, and a question that then gets echoed several times throughout the rest of the chapter, actually. Anybody know which question I'm talking about?
Saying by what right, by what code, by what standard.
That's the one. That's the one.
We're getting it in harmony from different parts of the table. Yeah. So he thinks by what right, by what standard is Philip making these condemnations of him. He then threatens to throw Philip out. And what happens? First of all, the family is not shocked. It's like they knew this was going to, it's like they knew this would happen sooner or later. They're not shocked like they didn't think this could happen. Rearden threatens to throw Philip out, and Rearden's mother and Philip are both, they're not shocked, but they're, in a bad situation, and they're surprised by what happens, but not as though it was something that was impossible to happen. And they try to invoke their moral code, but in a kind of tentative way, like, well, you wouldn't want me to think you were selfish, and don't I have any free speech, and you wouldn't want me to think this, and surely you're not an unkind person, and so forth and so on, you're not selfish and such. And Rearden sort of won't have any of these kind of olive branches, or Rearden's, intransigent. And yeah, he doesn't mean it, Hank, says Corey, and so forth. Well, let him learn what he means then, right? Rearden responds. Or he doesn't know what he's talking about. Let him learn. Philip says, anyway. So this is how Rearden responds. And his family is now what? They're no longer self-righteous as they've always been. They're tentative. They're trying to kind of negotiate some settlement with him whereby Rearden is basically in the right, but Philip doesn't know.
He disarms them, basically, because he took their weapon away from them.
He disarms them because he took their weapon away. Yeah, that sounds... their weapon being their moral code. Yes?
Still wants money to leave, though.
Okay, just one comment back on the religion question. I mean, this is all the religious language here, right? They're appealing to his conscience and pity and forgiveness and the evil of selfishness. This is all Christianity. I mean, really, there's no place else in our culture where this comes from.
Well, there are a lot of people who are not Christian who think you should have pity and have a conscience and
Not be selfish.
and you should not be selfish. Now, whether all of that's coming ultimately from Christianity, and there are people who, aren't Christian but haven't shed that element of it, is possible. Conscience is a little bit, he doesn't say I don't have a conscience, right? He says this won't prey on my conscience. So.
They're saying it will prey on your conscience.
Right, and he's saying it won't.
No.
He's not saying I don't have
That's
one.
their language, right?
Yeah.
Conscience is their language.
But it is not something you would expect him or Daphne to say. Philip says, considers leaving and says, well, I could leave, but of course, and he tries to get Hank to give him some money and then pretends that's not what he's trying to do. Ben, you had some thoughts about the how his family responds to this and what they're not doing and are doing.
You're probably talking about the how it is that Rearden notices and is surprised that his family, once he makes this stand and once he threatens to kick out Philip and once, and admits that he's selfish, they don't double down on the kinds of condemnations that they usually use when they're trying to, get him to go along with what they want. I mean, here he is threatening to throw out Philip, which is probably the toughest he's ever been, and they're not suddenly condemning him. They're not. Why didn't they throw at him all those accusations of cruelty and selfishness, which he had come to accept as the eternal chorus to his life? What had permitted them to do it for years? And that's when he says to himself, it's this sanction of the victim concept that he's been working on developing in previous chapters, which we've talked a little bit about already in this broadcast. But I mean, it is interesting that once he names the issue to himself and takes this stand, they're no longer able to use their usual trick on him, or at least they don't feel like they can. And some people could wonder, well, maybe this is just like they're being cynical and they don't think this guilt trip will work at the particular moment, and they'll be willing to do it again later, and maybe they will, but it is worth wondering about why at least they appear to be disarmed at the moment.
We have a amusing comment on it here. So
we're talking about the virus analogy. I'd say that now Hank Rearden's been vaccinated, so that virus can't infect him anymore.
Mm-hmm. They have the cooties. They have the cooties.
So that's a way to extend that analogy, that Francisco has vaccinated or inoculated him in some way or another. All right, let's skip ahead now to Rearden's trial, where we see he makes a similar stand, right? So we get at the beginning of the trial well, what happens at the beginning of the trial? How does the trial start? He's asked to enter his plea, and to start, making a plea in his own defense. And what does he do?
Premise. That he's done
He says he
anything
has no
wrong.
defense,
Yeah, he has no defense.
because he doesn't recognize their right to try him.
He doesn't recognize the court's authority to try him. So it's not that he's throwing himself on the mercy of the court, which is one of the things that that they might, that they're prepared for him to do. They don't expect that. But he says, no, I don't recognize your right to try me. He says, but you admitted that this is a court, the kind of court that the law says is the right court for this kind of offense, and you've admitted that you broke this law regulating, controlling the sale of your metal. He says, well, I don't recognize your authority to control my metal. Yeah, Lana says that I don't recognize your right to control the sale of my metal. Harry says he doesn't recognize the action as a crime. I won't repeat what Corey says, but appropriate. Don't recognize some of the points that a bunch of other people made about the last scene. Some really good points that I hopefully will get a chance to spiral back to. And they say, well, you recognize that there's a really serious penalty for this, and he basically dares them to impose that penalty, or he says, impose it then, right? And they say yes, but you're supposed to enter a plea in your defense. We want to give you a chance to defend yourself. And how does he deal with that point? You're making it seem like we're railroading you or mistreating you, but the issue is we're giving you a chance to defend yourself, and you're not. So where do you get off saying this is so unfair? I think how he responds to that point is really significant. Are we getting people saying?
We don't want it to look like we are depriving you of your rights. And he says, in effect, yes, that's exactly how I want it to look. I want it to look like.
Mm-hmm. Because you are doing that, and you need my help to pretend not. So Lana's coming in on this. Harry says he's complying with the law exactly as it is. Ken says you don't want it to look as if you've been railroaded, to which he responds more or less as Will says. Lana says, I will not play the part of defending myself where no defense is possible. I will not simulate the illusion of dealing with a tribunal of justice. And that's a quote from the novel. Dan says he calls out the need for his consent and refuses to give the consent. And I think those are the two crucial points, right? What he's saying is, I won't help you to pretend that this is a tribunal of justice, that there's a real issue of rights here where you're respecting rights and I could offer a defense. Quote, I volunteer nothing, again, quote, you need my help to make this procedure legal. Again, I will not help you. When he said you don't want it to look like you're being railroaded, what he says is, I want to let the nature of this procedure appear for exactly what it is. If you need my help to disguise it, I will not help you. Ben, were there any comments on this on the earlier threads?
Well, Lana had another interesting comment earlier where she mentioned that here Rearden is, well, actually, I don't want to mention that one just yet. Sorry, I've still been having technical problems and I've been discombobulated because of it. But it also occurs to me that Pooja mentioned in the comments earlier on that here Rearden seems to be making use of Francisco's advice about naming facts, which we discussed during the chapter where he's at the party, how everybody seems to know some fact, but nobody wants to name it. And sometimes all that you need to bring the whole system down is to name the fact that nobody's willing to admit. And I mean, that's explicitly what Rearden is even saying that he's doing when he's talking about how he's not going to help them pretend.
And this brings us to the flaw. He now says what the fatal flaw in their system is, right? And here's what it is. That, he says, that's the flaw in your system, right? If you choose to deal with men by means of compulsion, I'm quoting now, do so. But you will discover that you need the voluntary cooperation of your victims in many more ways than you can see at present. And your victims should discover that it is their own volition that which you cannot force that makes this possible. And this is the thing that Rearden's seen and been seeing more and more of from time to time. It's what he grasped in the case of Lillian's scheme of punishment. It's what he grasped when he was dealing with the traffic cop. It's what he grasped when Floyd Ferris came to see him, and now he's putting it into practice. And he told Dagny ahead of time that he there was a certain kind of stand he was going to take. He had a theory about what was going to happen and that they were going to let him off. And now we're seeing what it is. He's had the idea that there's this flaw. He's now going to try it out, and here he is trying out it in his trial. And the judges say, well, but you don't want to be misunderstood. You don't want to let people get the wrong impression of what you're doing. I'm sure you wouldn't want people to think such and such. And it's at that point that Rearden makes a speech, and it's now the speech that's quoted in, or that's excerpted in For the New Intellectual. And Ben, you were gonna walk us through some of the main points of that speech.
Yeah, just some main points, hoping that my tech holds out here. But I mean, so he starts out by naming the fact that he works for nothing but his own profit. But then he quickly clarifies what he means by that, because he wants to emphasize that the way that he does this is by trading with people, by giving them something that they value, and doing it by mutual consent to mutual benefit. And he also says it in a way where he's not implying that, oh, I work for my own profit just like everybody else works for their own profit and I'm no different from the rest of you, because he says that he does so proudly, and that he thinks it's wrong to do otherwise. He says he thinks it's wrong to pay his workers more than they're worth, wrong to make less money than the worth of the good that he's trying to sell. And he says, if you think by your standards this is evil, make the most of it. But basically he's saying by his standards, he won't accept this as guilt. Instead, he names it as something he's proud of. And he ends the little speech by saying, he could go and say that he's actually serving the public good by offering a product that's superior to anybody else's, by bringing value to society. He could say that the alternate system that the looters represent can never achieve the public good, that asking people to sacrifice and to become sacrificial animals can never achieve the public good. He could say these things, but he won't, because in doing so, he would be conceding the premise that the morality of sacrifice was legitimate. He doesn't want to sanction that code. And so he says, as a kind of ultimatum, if it ever came to the point where the public good did require his sacrifice, the public good be damned. And in saying that, he's echoing the line from the competitor of Nat Taggart that Nat Taggart wishes he could have said first. That's the long and the short of it. And that's the speech that's reprinted as the, I think it's called the morality of capitalism in the
moral meaning of capitalism.
The moral meaning of capitalism in For the New Intellectual, yeah.
Yeah.
And
so Mike says he wants us to turn to, as I said we would, applications of this to our own lives and uses of it in the real world. And we will in just a moment. That's the next topic, save one. But I want to just spend a moment or two on one issue before we go to that, which are, what are the immediate consequences of this, of his saying this in the trial? What happens?
To applause.
All right, so Corey says standing ovation. People saying here the crowd bursts into applause. And what else? What's the other immediate consequence? In some ways, even prior to that. What's the verdict? What do the judges do?
They scour given this really weak sentence.
Yeah,
And they
A
suspended
small
immediately.
fine and a suspended sentence.
yeah, they withdraw to figure out what to do with it. Well, I mean, they even prior to that, they're saying things like, "Well, Mr. Rearden, you didn't mean, and we understand that it's really Ken Danager who's at fault." And he says, "No, it was both of us." And but you know, and well, why are you speaking of guns? This isn't a really important case where that's it. So they're backpedaling and walking it back, as people said.
We know you did it because you were worried about the coal supply.
Right. We know you did it because you were worried about the coal supply, not for, no, I did it for my own profit. Now, Will, you raised a really good question about that that I want to get back to in a moment. But, I mean, you raised it online earlier.
He sees how weak the enemy is now. And
Yeah.
he realizes that
And Corey's saying it's just like his family who are backpedaling, and that's right. And then what the judges do, right, as Amos said a moment ago, is and Carrie Ann, is they give them a trivial sentence, and then they immediately suspend it, because he said he won't pay the money if you find him anyway. So,
Greg?
now, yeah, Ben.
Ken makes an interesting point in the comments that there's something similar about what Rearden's doing here to what he did back during the press conference where they opened the John Galt line, how he expects to make a boatload of money, but that it's also going to benefit the public. But I mean, I think that's right that there's that similarity, but one of the important differences between what he's doing here and what both he and Dagny, but especially what he did at the conference, is that he's now naming this as moral. He's not just saying, I'm going to make money and oh, by the way, you're going to also benefit. He's saying, I regard this as moral and I regard this as something I'm proud of. And the opposite policy is immoral.
And he's articulating the moral code on which he's doing it. Here's what in general I regard as moral, and here's how I'm doing it. Now, Will, you raised the question of, is he really doing this? Is he really acting for his own profit? Francisco's already asked him, have you made any money at a Rearden medal? It turns out he hasn't. Ken Danager, who did this deal with him, right, said that Ken Danager, only bought this coal mine that he was needing the metal to reinforce, not because he was going to make a profit from it, because he didn't dare to leave Taggart Transcontinental without coal and so forth. So there's a question as to whether Rearden's motives are really what he says they are. And if they're not really what he says they are, they're not consistently what he says they are, is that a way in which he's failing to live up to what he says, and that's bad, which Francisco later implies when he says, Mr. Rearden, I suggest you get a transcript of your script and see of your what you said at your trial and see if you're living up to it. Or on the other hand, maybe if the kind of moral code that Rearden is rejecting is right, and the book is pulling the wool over our eyes on this issue by making Rearden seem sympathetic, though he's someone who works only for his own profit. Maybe what's happening is the reason why Rearden strikes us as a sympathetic character is that he's not really acting in the way he claims that he's acting. And I know some critics of the book think that that's what's going on. Ben, yeah.
Related to that and to what Francisco says to him later about whether he's acting consistently on it, Francisco in the online chat notes also he saw the smallest of I think what she means to say is he saw the smallness of the enemy. And I think she's referring there to a passage on page 43 where Rearden comes to this realization that when he gets to the end here, when he wins this victory, he sees the enormity of the smallness of the enemy who was destroying the world. He had found a rat eager to scurry for cover at the first sound of a human step. Now, two things about this. One is that it connects to the question we had raised earlier in the evening about Rearden's reflecting on the nature of evil. And here it seems like he's doing it again. And the big evil is just this little rat. It's not a mustache twirling villain. That's interesting. And then the second point is that in the same passage is where Rearden says, if this is what has beaten us, he thought, the guilt is ours. And
there's a lot more to say about that part and some of the thoughts he has there. But can we just let's go to some of the real world application stuff before we come back to that? Because there, because I want to make sure that we do get to that, and I think we're at a point where we can start to bring some of that in. So what's happened here is twice now with his family and at his trial. I put Ben on when I meant to put myself on. Twice now at his family and at his trial, Rearden has taken a stand. He said, this is my moral code. This is what I stand for. You guys are trying to make me feel bad or guilty. You're trying to damn me. But on some other moral code, and I reject your whole premise. I am selfish. I do work for nothing but my own profit. I don't, Philip, I don't love you, and you don't mean anything to me. And stop trying to, as Will pointed out, Midas Mulligan put it, use my pity for you as a weapon. That's not going to work anymore. And in both cases in the novel, the people who were self-confident tormentors of him, or people who were in a position, at least in the second case, in the case of the judges, to impose real penalties on him, turned solicitous and backed down. So the question is, does that really work? Is that true? Does that happen? Is that how the world works? Are there cases like that? Or is this just a kind of awesome fantasy?
It works.
Yeah.
I don't know, if I look in my life where this issue comes up, it's simple things like family and coworkers, where you're talking at the lunch table and everyone is putting forward the idea that government is there to help us take care of the needy, and if we don't want to do that, we're selfish and we're not complying with the moral code. And of course they spend a lot of their own time going to church or participating in groups like that. And so if you don't go along with that, you're kind of excluded from a lot of things, and even having a conversation at the lunch table becomes difficult, right? Because you don't want to get in a big argument with your coworkers about a moral question which is not directly related to work and cause a lot of bad feeling. So it's just this constant barrier between yourself and other people, and that barrier always on the edge of becoming a disruptive discussion kind of a thing.
But how does taking a stand in that situation, what could you do that's analogous to Rearden's stand, and does it help?
Well, you can just state your viewpoint and try not to make it conflicting. And often it just goes at that.
Carrie Ann, do you want to come on?
I was not going to comment on Steve's case. I was wondering, are you dealing with question 3 from?
Yeah.
Historical
Okay,
cases?
so historical
Yeah.
cases.
I mean, it could be one's in one's own life, but also
Okay.
it could be. Well, let me just say a word or two about
Okay.
Steve, the issue Steve's raising, and then we'll go to the. I mean, if it's a case where you and people disagree, right, and you hold different moral standards, I don't think doing what Rearden's doing is always available to be done. It's available to be done in a situation where they're treating it like their moral standard is unquestionable. And my picture has frozen, but the rest of the system is working. That's interesting. They're treating it as though their moral standard is beyond question, and assuming that you will agree with it. And if that's a case where you can simply say, I disagree, and don't assume that I'm going to go along with this, because that's a situation where they're trying to use your acceptance of something they might not agree with. But if it's just like they're against abortion and you're for it, and they're not assuming that, but they're just talking among themselves who all agree with it, I don't think there's the same kind of issue. Although it still might be worth making your position known and not letting it, letting people assume you agree with them when you don't. But Carrie Ann, the historical cases, let's hear.
The one that leapt to my mind, only because I've taught it in one of my philosophy and law courses, is Mandela's speech from the dock, where he's addressing the apartheid court, and he explicitly says, I'm not going to defend myself. I reject the standard of justice by which you try me. This is a court where your standard of justice is only for white people. You've excluded me and others like me from holding land, from taking jobs, from migrating, etc. And he explicitly rejects their standard of justice and their right to try him in a court of law.
And what was the result of that?
The result of that was they compelled him to serve a very long jail sentence, which then made him into an international martyr.
So
To ultimately overthrow the apartheid regime in South Africa.
So this is a case where they didn't back down, but eventually he prevailed. I think there were a lot of examples of this in the civil rights movement. I mean, the whole civil disobedience and the way it was used, at least in some cases where you're disobeying an unjust law and you're saying, well, okay, then punish me for it and see if you're willing to really enact this punishment. I had an example of another one from the civil rights movement. What would you, Robert, is yours on this?
Patrick Henry one.
Okay.
At House of Burgesses, when he said Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I had his Cromwell, and King George, and all the treason. They're shouting out treason, and he says King George made profit from his example, and then he ends by saying, "If this be treason, make the most of it." And that's actually how Ayn Rand ends her argument from intimidation with that exact. So they back down basically after he made his moral stance.
Let me give you another civil rights relevant one, and then I want to give some other ones on different topics. This is one I don't think is very well known. I only learned about it a couple of years ago, and I wrote a little blog post about it. And I learned about it from a New York Times book review. The book review was by Brent Staples of a book called The Defender by Ethan McKelly. And The Defender is both the name of the book, but also the name of one of the African-American newspapers from the earlier part of the 20th century. And it's a book about that newspaper and its history. And the editor of that book was a guy, John Sengstackel. And there was a period in 1942 where The Defender and some of the other black newspapers were very critical of Roosevelt, and in particular of the fact that Roosevelt there was now segregation in the National Army, and they thought that this was validating at the national level the Jim Crow policies of the South, and it was really bad. And earlier, these newspapers had encouraged their readers to enlist, because this is a just war and so forth. And now these black readers who had enlisted are being, under racist policies in the military, and these papers had been very vocal about that. And this guy, Francis Biddle, who was Roosevelt's attorney general, called the editors of several of these newspapers into the White House to have a conference with them, and claimed that what they were saying was seditious and that he could shut them down. And according to this book, Sengstackel said, "You have the power to close us down. If you want to close us, go ahead and attempt it." And Biddle immediately caved, in part thinking about what kind of press it would be and so forth. And not only did he cave on the demand in that instance, but subsequent to that, at least as told by this book, the Roosevelt administration became a lot more respectful of, and in some ways solicitous towards, the interests of these black newspapers. So they had been not, for example, giving them much access to administration officials, and that all changed. So here's a situation, and it's the one that's closest to the literal, well, then go impose your sentence on me, right, that I know of. And it actually worked in the moment. So not only, after years in jail did it work, but immediately. Another one that's really strikingly like this in the tone that the person took and the defiance in the trial is Ezra Levant, who's I guess a conservative journalist in Canada. And in 2008, or shortly before 2008, I guess, he republished the cartoons of Muhammad that there was was published, the Danish cartoons by Fleming Rose. So he republished them in Canada. It was one of the few papers, too. And there was an earlier law, a human rights law in Canada, that said that certain kinds of things that arguably challenged human rights or whatever were tried before these little commissions. It wasn't a proper court. It was like a few people sitting around the table. And there's this video you could find on YouTube, which is really striking, of him sitting at this table with some couple of bureaucrats across from it about to take notes and just reading this speech. I don't recognize the right. This isn't a proper court, and you have no right to try this, and I have a right to do this, and this is a kangaroo court, and it's not a proper authority, and so forth. His case was dismissed.
Greg, I've just posted the link to that video in the comments section, by the way.
Thanks, Ben. Ben saying he posted the link. His case was dismissed. It took some time for it to get dismissed, and he still had to pay legal fees, but he won in that particular instance. And within a few years, in 2013, those relevant laws were overturned. So let me raise now a more contemporary case. Another article I posted a link to was about woke conservatives. And Robert, you made the point, you made a connection between what Rearden is doing here and what Ayn Rand in one of her nonfiction articles called the argument from intimidation. And this is where, somebody tries to get you to not hold a position or back down from a certain position by just, doing the kind of thing that Rearden's family was doing. It would be selfish, or everybody knows that that's bad, or presupposing in the way they treat the issue some moral code and that you might reject, but then using it as expecting you to back down because of it. And so what is this article about woke conservatives about? I had been thinking about this issue for some months now as an interesting connection to Atlas Shrugged and something to talk about when we got to this scene. As it just so happened this week, I came across this article that articulated the idea really nicely. And the idea is that liberals have been saying about every conservative that they're a racist for decades now, and that they're sexist, and that they're this, and that they're that, and that they're uncaring, and they're on this, and they're on that, and there's a whole litany, all white men are this, and privilege, and all these things that have been said supposedly, and have in fact been said, right, for many decades. And the claim is that this has been an attempt to guilt conservatives into being mild and meek and not following up on their policies, to not stand by their convictions, just to kind of curry favor with or the respect of these liberals who talk this way. And mainstream conservatives do this. Paul Ryan and so forth are meek in this way and me-tooing and pussyfooting around and won't take conservative stands. But now conservatives have become woke. Right? And woke is this word that's getting used a lot these days for, I think for the kind of thing that's happened to Rearden now at this point in the novel, right? When someone's woke, when they realize that there's some large injustice going around in their society that they've been unaware of or hadn't articulated until now, and now they realize it and they're acting accordingly. And so conservatives can become woke to the fact that liberals are doing this and say, we don't care about you. We don't accept your standards, liberals. And so we're not going to be guilt-tripped or manipulated into not saying and doing what we think. And the kind of marquee example of this is we're going to elect Donald Trump, and we're not going to be ashamed, and he's not going to be ashamed by any of your politically correct kind of attempts to guilt or manipulate us. So is this an example of what Rearden's doing?
I think the problem with that is that the right is religious and the left is religious. To attack the left position, you have to attack religion, right? Because all this compassion and stuff comes from religion. You can't stand up and support the 10 Commandments and say that compassion is no good. And that's why the left has power, because they have that moral high ground. You have to take that moral high ground away.
In a way, the right is the more religious, though, than the left.
The left says they're not religious, but it's all religion. Compassion is the love. God's love is compassion.
You would never hear about the religious left, even though it definitely exists.
Yes. It's all based on religion, right? Their whole thing. It might be restated by a philosopher, but it all comes from Christianity. So you have to take away that moral high ground, I think, if you want to not be intimidated by them.
Okay. For this being an example, I don't think I can see Rearden, much less Francisco d'Anconia, acting like I've seen these woke conservatives acting online, which is calling people cooks on their repertory of names. I think what actually happened is the left apparently never heard the story of the boy who cried wolf. Because this is what they've been saying about every Republican since Goldwater until people stopped paying attention to it. And that's how we got President Trump.
Okay, so Ben, you wanted to come in on this?
Did you want to talk more about this particular example first, or could I give mine? Because I did hear Will talk about people trolling online.
I wanted to say a little bit more about this example before we go to the more general point that you were going to make. But also Mike's, I want to see what Mike's saying, because he's concerned that we're not being practical enough. And is there a question by Mike that I missed? The psychological context. Mike, let's. It might be that you've got a long question that I'm not reading, but that I don't have time to read right now. But let's start a thread to discuss psychological and personal applications of these points on Facebook, and we'll start taking up that question there. Mike and others who are interested in it, and maybe we'll do a session on it if it doesn't come up indigenously as part of this. I do think these issues are important.
I will start a thread tomorrow.
Thanks, Ben. So part of so we're getting some differences between what's going on with the conservatives and maybe with Trump, although Trump is not a religionist, right? So one point coming from Steve is, and this is a theme running, Steve, through a few of your remarks, right, that the essence of what Rearden has to rebel against is religion, and religion is something that's shared between the present-day left and right, so neither side can be really doing this if they're not really rebelling against religion. Whether religion is the essence or core of the moral code that Rearden has to fight is a good question and a good thought. We'll see more as this code gets more articulated about what Rearden comes to think about that and what some of the other characters do. But in some of our other examples, like the Mandela and the editor of The Defender, right? Probably all of the people in these examples were, religious or believed in some of the kinds of things that you would think of as secularized versions of religion, and yet someone is able to make a moral stand in those cases and accomplish that. But I do think there's something really right about what both you and Will are saying here, which is that one difference in these cases, at least insofar with what some of the conservatives are doing who think of themselves as woke, and I think probably people who are saying I'm sick and tired of this liberal PC stuff are different from one another and fall into different categories. Some of them are doing things like standing up to this Alberta kangaroo court that I think Levant was doing, and somebody quoted an example of Jordan Peterson doing something similar, which I haven't followed. It seems like it might be a similar example. But what Rearden is doing is taking a moral stand where he's saying, this is what I'm for, right? Here's my moral code. This is what I'm for. And you guys are trying to impugn me on some other moral view, and I don't accept your standards. Now, somebody can do that, but if you just say, I don't care if you call me racist anymore, I'm going to continue saying my stuff, what are you doing? You're saying, I don't hold your standard, but you're not saying I don't hold it because I have some other standard, which is the right one. I mean, and so for anyone who's rejecting a standard on which he's being accused or put down and refusing to feel intimidated or guilted by that standard, we want to ask, are you doing it because you have some other standard that you're saying is the right one, and it's illegitimate for you to hold me to this standard, or you're applying this standard in the wrong way? Racism is evil, but here's what racism is, not what you say it is. Or someone who's saying racism is evil. Or are we talking about someone who is not doing that, right, but is just like, take Gerald Starnes, who we met earlier. He said, he steals a nickel from somebody or a dime from somebody. He said, go ahead, tell him I did it. I'll just say you're lying, and who are they going to believe? And so someone like that, you can't shame him, right? But that's not because he's has a better, different moral code. Yeah.
This might get to an issue that I had wanted to raise earlier, actually, which is that, so it's interesting that Rearden ends his speech by saying, the public good be damned. And that earlier we did find out that Nat Taggart had wished that he had said the same thing as his competitor. He's referring there, I think, to Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt did say this. But interestingly, when Vanderbilt said this, Vanderbilt did not bring the kind of moral perspective to saying it that Rearden does. I think it's important to understand the difference here, because, you could read what Rand is saying here and what Rearden is saying as a mouthpiece, that she just thinks that we shouldn't ever feel guilty about anything, and that this is going to lead some people to wonder, well, what is she just advocating, that we all be psychopaths? And we had a conversation about this earlier where I think you had some interesting things to say.
The issue is what Rearden's objecting to is this kind of virus-like strategy that I said earlier. Taking someone's moral rectitude, using it as a means to torture them by introducing an alien standard or a complaint against them on an alien standard, which you're expecting their taking morality seriously to lead them to apply this standard against themselves. And the solution to that isn't to drop morality or drop standards altogether, but to identify, well, what is the standard that's the basic one I'm acting on? And why is this complaint not consonant with that standard? Why is this complaint illegitimate? Yeah.
Greg, further to this point, I know that you wanted to say a little bit more about this elsewhere maybe, but as an example of the fact that what she's not saying here is that we should never feel guilty, or even that Rearden should never feel guilty, is the very fact that Rearden himself is saying the guilt is ours after this verdict, after he realizes the nature of the enemy. And if you recall, Francisco, and this was a question we had discussed some weeks ago, after Francisco gave the money speech at the wedding, if everything I said in this speech is true, Mr. Rearden, who's the guiltiest man in the room? And of course, Rearden wants to say, oh, is it James Taggart? You can't be talking about yourself, Francisco. Do we now have enough evidence to come to the conclusion, especially now that Rearden is himself saying the guilt is ours, that who Francisco was talking about was Rearden? And yet Rearden is his friend. So the way in which Francisco is appealing to guilt here is a very different way than the way in which, say, Lillian is. And I think it has something to do with the fact that it's the same standard. I mean, Francisco is asking Rearden to go by his own standard of what should make him feel guilty here.
And whether or not Francisco in the end means Rearden as the one who's the guiltiest man in the room, he has already told Rearden that he thinks he's guilty of a great sin, right? Indeed, yes. The sin of accepting this unearned guilt on the alien standard. So the view isn't you should never feel guilt or never acknowledge your guilt. It's that you shouldn't allow other people you shouldn't accept standards of morality contrary to the true one if you have it. Rearden is a moralistic person, a person who cares about morality, and that comes out of the way he's always lived, which is based on an understanding of certain moral principles. And we start to see we're seeing some of what these moral principles are in his trial, right? I knew that I had to earn my living and work to support myself, and we see some of them in his talking about absolutes and so forth with the kid. And he's articulating these moral standards that have been implicit the whole time in his way of being. And this is meant, I think, to be moral knowledge that he has. It's not just something he believes, but the code he's always acted on, which has made life possible and is what makes life possible and is the right code. And now that what he's realizing is that some of his moral responses have been due to the power that moral code gives him, having been hijacked by certain interposed or interjected commandments that come from a very different moral code. And that's what he's rejecting. And so the question when somebody says, I reject your standards, and I'm not going to feel guilty in the way that you say I should, that we want to think about is, are they someone who's acting like Rearden, or are they someone who is a rotter, right? Rearden says, if I were the kind of rotter that you're claiming I am, then your guilt trip, your punishment would have no effect on me. Lillian's punishment would have no effect on me. One thing you can do is, well, then I'll just be that kind of a rotter and no punishments will have any effect on me. But that's not what Rearden's strategy is. Rearden's strategy is, I'm not that kind of person, and I'm going to realize that there's a kind of hypocrisy or lie in the standard they're trying to hold me to. Now, what I think is right about this point that the people calling themselves woke conservatives are making is that there is a lot of attacks on America and American society and American principles that do proceed, I think, in the way that the attacks on Rearden are proceeding. America as a country and Americans care about justice. And so there's a lot of pointing out real or alleged respects in which America has been unjust. Sometimes real respects, sometimes alleged respects that aren't real. And then saying, therefore, as a country, you're crap. Therefore, you shouldn't have any self-esteem. You're not a moral nation. But if we really weren't a moral nation and our people didn't care about what's right and wrong, or enough of us didn't, then those kind of appeals wouldn't have any audience. They wouldn't have any grip. They wouldn't work. And so insofar as somebody's trying to make those appeals work, there's a kind of lying or BS in it, as opposed to an appeal that said, you guys are people who take morality really seriously, and let me point you to a way in which you've not been doing it, which is what Francisco does to Rearden, right? You have this principle, you take this principle seriously. Are you really applying it consistently? Let me suggest to you that you're not. And I think that that is the kind of thing that the civil rights movement at its best was doing, right? The kind of thing that Rearden, that Francisco is doing to Rearden, as opposed to this is a fundamentally, deeply, in every way unjust society, and down with it all. But where you're not really trying to bring it down directly, you're trying to convince the people in it to accede to your demands in that way. And I think some of what the people who think of themselves as woke conservatives or anti-PC or whatever are responding to is that kind of attempt to guilt America or Americans. And I think there's something right about that. But I don't think that's what we're seeing now ascendant on the right myself. Yeah, Ben?
I think your last point raises a question that we're going to have to come back to later in our discussion of the book later this year or early next year, which is, well, if you do think that your society is fundamentally, basically evil and doesn't share your standards, then what do you do? Because you can't appeal to the standard that they hold in common, right? That is disingenuous and won't work because they don't have a standard in common. What is the proper recourse? And that's a question that you could ask just sort of academically of what you just said, because it seems like there's a little loophole there that it hasn't been filled yet. But I actually think that question has a great deal of significance for what's happening in the society of this novel. So, but I don't want to.
It's true of a society as a whole and also of an individual. So even if your society isn't fundamentally unjust, if, say, you decide that your wife is, as maybe is the case with Lillian, what should Rearden do? Try to guilt her over it?
Right.
Or what? Yeah. So I think this is a kind of big question here. And just one thing to think about, because I don't think every movement and every person is going into a moral dilemma that they're facing always on one side or the other. There's choice and there's ability to rise to occasions or sink below them. And if you're noticing that this kind of moral attack is being leveled against you or your country or your party or a movement you're part of or people you care about, is what you're doing what Rearden's doing and saying, I am someone who takes morality seriously. This is the morality I take seriously. And this criticism you're leveling against me is illegitimate for this reason. But I take seriously being good and being right and being principled. And here's what I think are the things I can do to improve, if there are any. Like Rearden is saying, I'm not guilty of what they're accusing me of, but there's something I've done wrong since I've let these people have some kind of power. How can I fix that? Is that what you're doing? And in the case of the kind of complaints about racism or sexism, are you saying I think racism and sexism are bad things, and yet the certain allegations of them against me or my friends or whatever are illegitimate because they're misunderstanding what those are? Or do you reject the idea that these things are evil, racism and sexism, because they're unjust? You think they're not unjust? Or what is your position? Or are you, I'll say for my position, I think they are unjust, but I don't think all the allegations of them are just allegations. Or are you somebody who's shameless, right? That is, which is a criticism that's made of Trump, whether shameless is the right word, but someone who's unprincipled, unscrupulous, which is what the critics, or many of the critics of this movement in recent conservatism or recent right-wingism say, you just have dropped moral standards altogether. And so you're going down to the level of Gerald Starnes. And I think if you look at people who think of themselves as right-wingers who are woke to the fact that the left has been manipulating them in this way, you'll find some people who I think are just Gerald Starneses who are coming out into the open. You'll find some people who are much closer to Hank Rearden's. And you'll find a lot of people probably who have elements of both in them and are confused, and those elements are vying for who are they going to be. And if that's you or someone you know, these things aren't preset. You determine who you're going to be. All right, so that's,
Greg,
I think, a serious
33
real-life
after
implication.
the hour,
of this.
so maybe we should be moving
I know.
on to the last
We're
topic.
over time, but we said we might go over time a little bit, and then we had technical difficulties. There's a lot we can talk about the various parties' reactions to the trial, but I think we should skip over that and move to the last scene with Rearden and Francisco. Ben, is that cool with you?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
All right. Now, the high point or marquee thing from this scene is the meaning of sex speech and discussion, and we're mostly going to do a separate session on that. But let's talk about the other elements of this scene between Rearden and Francisco. We'll say a little bit about sex, and then if we have any time left, we'll just spiral back for any miscellaneous points from the chapter we want to come to. So, first thing to observe, Rearden goes to Francisco this time himself. It's the first time he goes and visits Francisco. It's always been Francisco showing up. And he wants to talk about Francisco's character. Right? He doesn't want to talk about his trial. He starts off with, I know you had a lot you wanted to tell me, and so forth. And Francisco says, no, it's too soon to finish saying what I wanted to say, which is odd because he was ready to say it that day that he came. But now when he came and they were interrupted by the furnace breakout, but now he says it's too soon to say it. But Francisco says, I'll agree to any topic you want to talk about to have you here. He doesn't, and Rearden wants to talk about Francisco's character. An interesting observation, and a few people have pointed this out, Francisco makes mistakes. He's less calm than he wants to appear, Rearden notices. A few times, including maybe in the furnace breakout scene, he gets ahead of himself and says things he wasn't intending to say. One of the things we haven't talked about, which we would have if we had more time, is the way all the business leaders in the world react to Rearden's trial. And one thing, Francisco's upset about that. He says, it's been 12 years and I still can't be calm about it. And Rearden's like, 12 years since what? And Francisco doesn't seem to want to say. Since I first understood what men like that were doing. But Rearden has a sense that he didn't mean to say 12 years. He's let something slip. And indeed, Rearden notices that it's been 12 years since he's been on the headlines acting like a playboy. Let's talk about Francisco's reaction to Rearden's trial for a moment before we move on to the revelations Francisco makes about himself and the state of their relationship. So how does Francisco react to Rearden's trial? Rearden was disappointed that Francisco wasn't there, which is kind of sweet. Francisco tells him right on that the first thing Francisco says when Rearden said, don't you want to finish what you were telling me, is you've been doing it, wonderfully without me. And he says, you mean at my trial? And he says, I mean at your trial. I heard it on the radio. Right.
You weren't there.
Yeah. Rearden's characterization of what he did at his trial, or what Francisco's take on it would be, is right. What was it like hearing your lines with me as your stooge? And Francisco says that they weren't my lines. Aren't they the things you've always lived by? And that's that idea of what Francisco's doing is naming what Rearden's lived by. Where have we heard that idea besides Francisco saying it's what he's doing of Rearden, by the way? We heard it one other time.
Dagny said it to Francisco too.
Not exactly, I don't think. The one I'm remembering, maybe there's more than one, is Daniger. When Dagny comes to Daniger, she's wondering what it is that the guy who was in the office before her said that made him totally do this about face, and now he's quitting, and he's like a different person almost in some respects. And he says, what could it, and he said, if you think he's told me something, well, all he's done is named what I'd always lived by, what every man lives by, at those times that he doesn't spend destroying himself. That's a slight paraphrase, I might have a word or two off. But what I've always lived by is right. And so Francisco says he's doing to Rearden what Daniger says someone did to him, maybe Francisco. Anyway, Francisco says two other interesting things about Rearden's trial, though, besides that they're Rearden's own thoughts and words, what he's always lived by.
One is if a businessman had the courage to say that, we would have to say those things that they work for their own profit, we would have saved the world.
Yeah, he said it's a couple of generations too late, and if somebody had the courage to say this earlier, it would have saved the world. Rearden says, I haven't given up the world. Francisco says, oh, yeah, I can never be totally lost, but, oh, what he would have saved us. So,
and I've been wondering just what did he mean by 3 generations?
3 generations ago.
That was when industrialism started to take the quote
Ben?
robber baron era, most likely, that these great men of ability never spoke up morally for what they created.
Ben, you had a thought on this. Actually, it's one of the issues you said a little bit about earlier.
Yeah, I think Robert's right, and we're actually going to find out a little bit more about this in the next chapter, and I don't want to give that away too much, but I don't think I will if I make the same point that Vanderbilt, when he said the public good be damned, didn't bring this moral perspective to what he was doing. And I actually looked up the story. Someone asked him why he was running a line at a loss. He said, are you doing it for the public? And he said, no, the public be damned. We have to do it because all of our competitors are doing it. And he didn't really, businesses run, businesses have to compete.
Robert has a historical point relative to the story.
William Vanderbilt, the son. Whenever we say Vanderbilt, we always mean Cornelius, but
That's
in this
right.
case, it's his son, William.
That's right. That's right. It is William. It is William.
Okay. Yeah, when is this period? Several generations ago. It's more recent, I guess, than the time of Nat Taggart, where the novel leaves it kind of systematically ambiguous how many generations away Dagny is from Nat Taggart. If you try to work it out, you'll find that you can't. And there's some weird things, like Dagny refers to somebody as Nat Taggart's grandson, the guy who built a tunnel or a bridge or whatever. Well, this is like...
I keep wondering, did these other Taggarts have names?
Yeah. And is this her father or her grandfather or her great-grandfather? Why wouldn't she call him grandpa? But he's someone in her line of succession. So anyway, I think it's written this way to make us think that Nat Taggart was important and the other people, there's always been a Taggart to run the railroad, and they were productive people, but somehow they're not meant to be significant characters in their own right, and we're not meant to know exactly how many there were for some reason.
And stay tuned to what Francisco says about Nat Taggart in the next chapter, everybody. That'll be important.
One of the things Francisco says about Rearden's speech is it's in effect too late, or it would have accomplished more earlier, a generation ago. And the other I've already mentioned is he asks Rearden whether he's living by it consistently, whether he's really practicing what he preaches. And Rearden says, you mean to say that that I'm not? And he says, well, read the transcript, judge for yourself, think about it. So there's the suggestion that there's more going on here. Okay, other plot points in this scene. We learn that Francisco is not really a playboy. We've had some reason to think maybe this is true before. He reveals it to Rearden. He tells him he's faking it, being a playboy, that he's doing it for a purpose of his own. He wants to be known as a playboy because a playboy is a man who just can't help letting money run through his fingers. We already know that he's sabotaging his company, so why he would want that, and the playboy juggled the books and so forth. We can see how this fits with some of what he's said earlier. So that makes, should be intelligible to us. We still don't know what his purpose is ultimately, but somehow he's sabotaging his business. He wants to be known as a playboy in order to do that. He tells Rearden this, he tells Rearden, "You're the first person I've told. Some other of my friends know it, but you're the first one I've told." And that's another thing. He's impatient. You've made me impatient for the first time, right?
Yeah, Greg, and he also says that he's breaking one of his rules in telling him this, which he's done a few times before with other things that he's told Rearden that he didn't think that he should. And why? I mean, so if you didn't know what these rules were about, you would think that anybody would want to tell a close friend that he wasn't really a playboy. But of course, he hasn't told him this before. He hasn't told Dagny this before. So what's going on?
And of course, one of the things that he told Rearden before that he said he's breaking a rule by telling him is don't deal with Stankonia Copper in any way, which becomes very significant at the end of this scene. The other thing, though,
Right.
that before we turn to that, right, is there's been a lot of indications that he still loves Dagny. But now we have him basically say, I mean, he doesn't say Dagny, but I've only loved but one woman in my life, and I've never even told that to her. So, which, you know, further complicates the situation, since neither of them know that they have the same romantic interest. But they both love the same woman, which is interesting. And we know that he loves Dagny, and that's something we might have suspected for all this time. Ken Doolittle says he also told Dagny that he hasn't been with Miss Gilbert Vale, or at least he kind of, you know, gave her the tools to notice that. But he didn't say what he said to Rearden, which is, I've not slept with any of those women, right? The whole thing is a charade, or charade. Which...
So whatever his charade or charade is, has got to be a pretty big deal, so that he is purposefully sabotaging his relationship with his only love because of it.
Yeah, that he's right. And there's the other thing that we learn, right, is that he still has hopes to get Dagny back, because Rearden asks, "Have you lost her?" And he says, "God, I hope not." Right. So, but it'll all be over soon. So whatever he's up to, he thinks, you know, he thinks he's nearing completion of it. All right. There's so much to say about the money speech. I mean, just the sex speech. Yeah. Let's make sort of one more point about the scene with them. Let's not talk about the sex speech at all tonight, and we'll do it on the supplemental broadcast about the sex speech and relationships in it. And well, let me just read off what I think are a couple of themes from the speech, right? Just so that they're on record, right? Important to it is a rejection of both a sexless love and loveless sex. The idea that sex is an effect of self-esteem and an expression of self-esteem. And Ben, you had a point about how this tied to the money speech.
Right. So when Francisco initially gets into this conversation, he says, "Did it ever occur to you that it's the same issue? The men who think wealth comes from material resources has no intellectual root or meaning. For the same reason they think sex is a physical capacity independent of the mind." And I mean, this issue of whether sex and economics intersect on important questions about morality has been an ongoing issue for Rearden. And I've been commenting on this for a few chapters now. In the last chapter, when he was remarking to Dagny in a conversation about, you know, why she thought he didn't pay enough attention to his pleasure, his own pleasure, Rearden had said, "Oh, Francisco said the same thing, though on a different issue." And well, now we're starting to see whether or not it really is a different issue. And, you know, furthermore, Francisco himself had, in the earlier chapter, raised, you know, why is it that you live on one principle with your mills, but not with the rest of your life? And earlier chapters, Rearden had talked about how he felt the same kind of guilt when he was hiding his relationship from Lillian with, as when he was hiding his relationship with Daniger and so forth. So this is cashing in on another line of development. Francisco is plugging together two things that didn't seem to be the same before.
So we're getting Mike's making some points about what a good sex life depends on and about the theory of sex that we get in this speech.
I'm
and
on the
that's the
camera,
kind of
Greg.
stuff that I want to that's the kind of stuff that I want to hold off on discussing till our section on till we have a special session on sex, because there's just so much to say about that. But one further point to make about the speech interaction is that Rearden at the one point says, well, at least I never accepted that other tenant, that is the one about sex. I did the one about money, rather, because I did accept the one about sex, that sex is evil and depraved, right? And in particular, that it's unconnected from your mind and from your rational values, and that's why it's evil and depraved. And Francisco says, no, you never would have accepted any part of their vicious doctrine. And Francisco has, up until this point, talked about two kinds of people who accept this doctrine. But Rearden doesn't fit into either of those types of people. We'll talk more about that at the second. And he says, what would happen if Rearden tried to force himself to accept this doctrine? And we get a pretty good description of exactly what happened with Rearden, right? He found himself drawn, despite himself, to the highest type of woman he could find. Now, there's an interesting point there that I just want to name. Something that's going on in this novel is there are different ways of accepting points. Rearden didn't really accept this mind-body dichotomy with respect to sex, not in the way the other kinds of people Francisco was talking about accepted it. And yet, he did in a way accept it. I mean, he said it, he fought against his desire to sleep with Daphne, he damned himself and her for it. And so there's some kind of theory going on in the psychology of this novel of there are like levels at which you could accept something. Rearden in some way has always accepted this code that Francisco is now telling to him. This has been the code he's always accepted and lived by in some sense, but not in the sense that he knew it explicitly and would say it and would stand by it. So Ram, while she was writing this, had a metaphor of there's the sub-basement and the superstructure, and there's what you accept in the sub-basement, deep down subconsciously, and then there's what you articulately have that you're talking about. And I think whatever terms we use for it, we want to keep that distinction in mind. Ben?
I think that's really important and interesting, especially when you think back to, and I'm often referring back to the chapter, the non-commercial, about the anniversary party, because at the beginning of that chapter, we get that Rearden is paralyzed because he doesn't understand why it is he can't motivate himself to go to this party and to be a better husband for Lillian, because he's always, in the rest of his life, whenever he believed something was right, he was always motivated to do it. His emotions always followed from his considered judgments. And one of the questions we raised back then was, well, how could this be? Why doesn't his usual policy apply? And I think what you're getting to now is part of the answer to the question. And it's alluded to again in this chapter, because Rearden's again struggling, or not so much struggling, but noting the fact that, yeah, I never really have been able to make myself feel guilty about this. And could it be because he never really believed that it was wrong, what he was doing, that he could never make himself believe that it was right to care about Lillian being who she is and given everything that Rearden wanted, from a wife.
There's a way in which, or a level at which, he didn't believe it and did believe the other thing, even if there was some other level or way in which his beliefs were different. Well, let's take a couple of minutes to just talk about one other issue unconnected to this speech that I think will be a nice note to end on, which is we have an unexpected positive character in this chapter. Say again, Robert?
The wet nurse. He's growing. He's no longer non-absolute.
Yeah, how is it that Rearden comes to think, how is it that he comes up in this chapter at all? How's he
He's at
introduced?
the office on Thanksgiving, and they bond over the fact that neither of them has a family to speak of, and also he comes back again about you gave them a whipping, and what's that? So he's growing in...
Does anyone remember, this is a point Ben made to me when we were planning this the other night, what the transition is by means of which the character gets brought up?
Well, he's-
Because he's at his family dinner, he suddenly remembers the encounter with the youth in the office and how different that was.
yeah, he's driving to New York from Philadelphia.
Ben, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's the dim sense of contrast passage on page 471. By some dim sense of contrast which he did not define, the thought of his family was replaced by the thought of his encounter with the wet nurse, the Washington boy of his mills. And yeah, and then we get that he doesn't have a family to go home to. It's like both of them see the mills as more their home than their respective family entities.
And what's the sense of contrast?
His family.
Yeah, Will's saying that Rearden has become his family. And what's the sense of contrast?
Oh, well, I mean, I think there are a few interesting contrasts, but the one that leapt out at me was that the wet nurse was looking at Hank like a hero, which is the complete opposite of his family, who wanted to see him as this lowly criminal.
Yeah, so that...
Greg can't hear you.
So Carrie Ann was saying the wet nurse is looking at him like a hero, which is opposite his family. And what has his family been talking about at dinner? And most recently, before he leaves, I mean, what are they talking about?
Now, there are no heroes. That's what Lillian's been saying.
New York tonight.
Oh, so a few different things. There are no heroes, Ben points out, and the wet nurse thinks or maybe feels or thinks in this subterranean way that there are heroes in Rearden's one. There's You Can't Go to New York Tonight, which is a really interesting one.
Yeah,
Although,
the other, she doesn't actually say you can't go to her tonight.
right.
And whom Lillian still doesn't know who she is.
But that one's not immediately germane to the wet nurse, since he doesn't know about this affair either. But yeah, but there's that is one of the things they've been talking about. But another is the trial. And how does the wet nurse relate to the trial?
He could have sold out Rearden for those friends in Washington who occasioned expenses, and he chose not to.
Yeah.
Or he could have said, I can still help you get an essential need exemption, like he did before.
I mean, in a certain sense, the wet nurse should have sold Rearden out. I mean, his job was to watch for Rearden doing stuff like this and report him. And his family, right, you would think they're the people who ought to be on his side. And so there's a real contrast here. The wet nurse is, yeah, in that sense, Robert's saying the wet nurse is like his family. They both want to be at the mills rather than anyplace else. The wet nurse didn't sell him out, although can't say why or won't say why, and is a little uncomfortable identifying the reason why. And then, of course, after it, he's excited. After the trial, you sure gave them a beating, and he wants to know what a moral premise is, and there's this cute exchange between them.
He studied metallurgy, which we didn't know that earlier, right?
No, we did know that he
Okay,
studied
that's
metallurgy
right, yeah.
earlier, because
But he didn't-
in
he
the
thought it was a
scene that's
categorical
introducing him and making
Yeah.
fun of him, it's like,
Yeah.
he would say, while having been a student
Right.
of metallurgy, iron ore, it seems to me, is hot, or something, some vague, weird thing. Any last thoughts on the wet nurse as a character and what's going on with him?
Well, he has a sense of moral certainty, at least about something now. When he's trying to figure out what a moral principle is, and when Hank prods him to see why he's making the judgment and he is, and how can he be sure of it? He's like, but I am sure, and that's what is the sign of him having a moral premise. It's a certainty of his own judgment, even if he doesn't understand fully what it's about.
Ben?
Yeah, Greg. There's an echo. Now it's gone. So I think it's interesting that passage with the wet nurse comes up right after a brief exchange that Hank has with Dagny, where Dagny says, "You've proved that the right always works and always wins, provided one knows what is right." And that raises the question, well, if Rearden at this point really does know what's right, and you could argue that from what he said in the speech, wouldn't it follow then that he's going to start to win? And so we'll have to look and see what happens. But then again, we have Francisco saying that he's not acting consistently with everything that he claims to know in that speech.
And there's some in particular that Francisco suggests is the issue. Rearden says, there's something I want to tell you. I'm going to go on selling my metal illegally. And Francisco says, look, you've been willing to do it while you're damned for it. You've been willing to do it in this situation, in that situation, with this problem. Now you're willing to accept the risk of the role of a criminal for doing it, for the sake of basically keeping this system alive and keeping this system going. And Rearden says, no, that's not why I'm doing it. He thinks that the system that they're living under with these evil, non-objective courts and so forth is going to crumble of its own accord, and he's going to outlast it. So we get, Francisco thinks that by continuing to produce this metal illegally, Rearden is not acting on these principles, and he's not doing what's right. Rearden thinks he is, and we have to see how that difference of opinion is resolved. And that brings us to the last plot point, which we should at least mention.
Which is, Francisco basically says, by the way, who the heck are you going to get this copper from to make this anyway?
And let the guy inform on you.
It's apparently somebody that Rearden thinks he can really trust. And he told Dagny earlier in the chapter, someone who will not betray me. And it turns out he thinks it's Francisco who will never betray him.
And he tells Francisco that he's ordered the copper from him. He says, in particular, the copper is on a ship that left port, and he gives the date. And when Francisco hears it, he's shocked and upset. Odd that he should be so upset about knowing what date the ship left port on. And he says, I told you never to deal with Stankonia copper. And Francisco seizes the telephone, and he's static. He doesn't move. But Rearden can tell there's a great struggle going on in him. And he doesn't lift the telephone. And he says, Hank, Mr. Rearden, for the time when you're going to damn me, I swear to you by the woman I love that I am your friend. It's a paraphrase thing. He says, for the time you're going to damn me and when you're going to not believe everything I said to you. And he says it with this look that Rearden recognizes as a peculiar dignity that attends a helpless plea, or something he knows to be a hopeless plea. Ben, you might have the passage in front of you.
You basically
and of
got
course, Rearden thinks of that several days later when he learns that the ships were sent to the bottom of the ocean by Ragnar Danaskjöld, who we know, at least Francisco used to know. Stay tuned for another exciting installment of Atlas Shrugged and the Atlas Project next Tuesday night.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.